this talk, Adventures in Words and Music, Vanessa asked me to choose an aspect of my work over the past few years that I could talk about, and this has been a real passion of mine, so I decided to talk to you specifically about the projects that I have created or co-created over the last, I guess it's 10 years, which involve the combination of words and music in a number of very different ways. All of this began for me because I started taking acting classes in 2001 for a bit of fun, and I realised not only did I really enjoy it, but it started to have a really big effect on my announcements on stage, the way I felt I could relate to the audience at all times when I wasn't playing. And then quite unexpectedly, I realised it was actually having a huge impact on my playing. And that made me even more interested in exploring this side or this art form of acting. So I started sort of ramping up the acting lessons, and I started having one-on-one lessons, and I did a night of summer school and all kinds of things. I started having vocal training and everything. I just became really quite interested in how this was affecting my playing, but I then also started becoming interested in actually doing some acting, and very kind of gung-ho of me, I had met David Williamson, Australia's great playwright, at the Noosa Long Weekend Festival, of which he's a patron, and he'd heard me play there a couple of times. He's a great music supporter, and I just very bizarrely one day plucked up the courage to send him an email and say, very shyly, look, I've been doing a little bit of acting, and if you ever need a guitarist as a cameo in one of your plays, I would be really interested. And for some reason, this struck some kind of chord with him, and he arranged for us to meet up and to have a kind of a brainstorming session, and he asked me for all kinds. I went there with all kinds of ideas of things, you know, I'm going to have a meeting with David Williamson, I've got to have something to sell, so something that, you know, we can do, because it became clear to me that he wanted to sort of create a whole new project. And I went there with quite a specific idea of the guitarist Ida Presti, and that I could possibly play her, and beautiful love story with her husband Alexander Lagoya. She was killed tragically young, blah blah blah, and he was just not interested. And anyway, we talked through various other possibilities. Not a lot of guitar stories involving women, because most guitarists are men. It's a very male-dominated world, so there's not a lot of, you know, guitarists in the history of the guitar, especially, that were female. So anyway, eventually he said, look, just tell me about your family. And I thought, oh, this meeting's over, so I just started telling him casually about, you know, my various family members. And somehow, and I can really only put it down to intuition, he became really fascinated with my grandmother, Lotte, who was an incredible character. She actually passed away just a few weeks ago. And she was an amazingly resilient, humorous, positive person who had some really, really difficult experiences in her life. And he became really fascinated and just kind of made the decision, without any kind of support from me, that he was going to write a play about her in which I would play her and myself. So that's how it came about. The play was called Lotte's Gift. So very bizarrely, I made my acting debut with a play written for me by David Williamson, which was a very strange and extremely daunting experience. We premiered it at the Noosa Long Weekend, and David said, oh, you know, it'll just be, just in a little theatre in Noosa, don't worry about it. And of course, it's a brand new David Williamson play. So the national media were there, and I was like, oh dear. Anyway, I can honestly say I have almost never been so nervous and uncomfortable. But once I got on stage, it was bizarrely sort of okay. And the play went through many versions and various directors. David actually himself as his debut as a director, directed the first version. We then took it to the Ensemble Theatre in Sydney, and then we toured it and ended up going all over the place. And I did, I think, about 160 shows. So that was the beginning, and it was a very big and very challenging project for me to play multiple characters, including myself, which every actor will tell you really shouldn't attempt, at least not early on. So I'm just going to give you, this obviously isn't going to be a staged performance in any way, but I just thought I'd give you a couple of tiny snippets so you get an idea of how this play works. So I'm actually going to just give you the very beginning, and I'll skip a little bit, it will make sense, and then I'll play, and then I'll talk to you a little bit more. Good afternoon. All families have their villains, their heroes, their failures, and their stars. Our family is a little short on villains and heroes, but we do have a star. Grandmother Lotta. She denied, of course. She thinks of herself as just another grandmother. But she isn't. I've been fortunate enough to have a wonderful life as a guitarist, but the roots of my love of music trace directly back to her. On Sunday nights, there's nothing I enjoy more than to sit and talk to her. She makes me bring my guitar and play. One evening a few years back, I looked at her, and the thought that she wouldn't be around forever hit me with great force. And I realised that although we'd spoken thousands and thousands of words to each other, there were some things I never felt able to ask her. Suddenly, I felt it was time. I know you hate to talk about the war. It has so many horrible memories. But the photos of you back then, you looked so young and happy and beautiful. Karin, I tell you truthfully, I was known as the most beautiful girl in Grünberg. It might seem like a vain thing to say, but it was true. And if something is true, why not say it? Men admired me and chased me, danced with me, and tried to seduce me. But I was nobody's fool. I couldn't go with anyone I didn't love. Never. My father watched me like an eagle. But when I was 16, the man who was to become the great love of my life came to town. Oh, Grandpa Heinrich. No. No? Let's hear some of your music. Lotte, who? Horst. You told me Horst was just a childhood friend. Well, he was strong, he was manly, and when he spoke, he had a beautiful voice. One night, when I was 17, he was upstairs in bed in his grandmother's house with the flu, so my father let me visit him. I went up the stairs. The moon was shining on his handsome face, and he told me that one day he would take me in his boat down the river. He looked at me lovingly. He touched me softly. So of course we kissed, tenderly, beautifully. I don't think I ever experienced a kiss as beautiful as that again. The love of your life. Play for me, Karin. Play something wonderful. Play Werde Alma, Innocent Soul. So many more things are revealed by Lotte along the way, many things that surprised me. And I have to say, as this play was being written, David Williamson based it largely on her memoirs, which she had written, which none of us admittedly had read at that stage. And he also came and interviewed the family, which was like a weekend of family therapy, finding out things that we did not know about each other, because he didn't ask easy questions. So many more things are revealed about Lotte, her incredible voice, the fact that her father wouldn't let her study singing because he felt it wasn't a decent career for a young girl who was very intelligent. So all kinds of things are revealed, and she goes on to meet her husband. She gets an incredible offer from a very major international radio producer who falls in love with her voice and wants to make her a big star, and her husband discourages her and says he doesn't want his wife to leave the house and the family and so on. But I'm just going to do one more little extract, which is actually Lotte talking about the war, and the piece of music that I chose for this section is actually by an Australian composer, Philip Houghton. I won't play all of it. It's a piece called Stelae, and these are actually stelae, which are sort of statues that were erected in memoriam of soldiers. So it's very appropriate in its sort of substance and the imagery and the music. Then the bombs started falling on Grünberg. The first time it happened, we were unprepared, and tell me, 148 people, Karin, dead. Grünberg didn't have a hospital, so we hurried to help the injured and dying with as many first aid supplies and medicines as we could carry. People were screaming in pain. We did what we could, but many of them were past help. A man I knew was holding his 5-year-old dead son, asking everyone if his son really was dead. His pain was indescribable. No more, Karin. No more. Please, play. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an insight into how the play works. It was probably just slightly more than half words, and probably almost half was music. And we also had projections. We had family photos and various images. At that stage we had obviously war images. So the projections were also part of the play. For me, apart from the very obvious challenge of acting, the other big challenge for me in this work and performing this was the fact that I had to change very quickly from acting to playing, and I haven't done it today, but in the play I run around the stage and, there's a full set and everything. So to have to go from that into just picking up the guitar and playing, no kind of, focusing and warm up and all the things we normally do, was a real challenge. And I found that what really helped me was realising that the words and the drama had already created an atmosphere, and that if I linked into that atmosphere, which essentially I had created, although I always feel when Lotta's speaking that it's not really me, very silly, but anyway, which I had sort of put into the room, then I felt like I could sort of play into that. The things that were special to me about doing this, apart from the family connection and what a great gift it was to my family and to my grandmother, was realising how potent the combination of words and drama and music can be. And there are many scenes which are very, very emotional, both happy and sad. And I found that the audience would inevitably cry actually when I was playing immediately after that scene. So the music was heightening what had just happened. And that was really wonderful for me. And also to be able to present so much classical guitar music to what was largely a theatre audience, and to have people really, really appreciate the music because it was put in a context that they could relate to. So that was very special for me, and I ended up performing that on and off for about 4 years, and I probably will perform it again in the future because it's so close to my heart. So this triggered, obviously, a great passion for combining words and music, and I became quite determined to continue to explore this. So the next place that my adventures took me was to a wonderful friend of mine and a composer who's also a wonderful writer of words and a visual artist. She's one of these incredible Renaissance people. Her name is Mary Damani, and she wrote a solo for me called Portraits of 4 Australian Women. And again, she wanted to do something quite different. It was her idea to try to get me to speak and play at the same time. So using, I suppose, some of the skills that I had learnt, but in a very different way. And for me, this represented a really big challenge. For anyone that's ever tried to do it, speaking and playing at the same time is actually very difficult. It's singing and playing is difficult, of course, but when you're speaking, you're not actually speaking in time with the music. So she wrote in the words at certain points where she wanted them to appear, but they're not in the rhythm of the music. In fact, they sound very strange if they're in the rhythm of the music. It doesn't sound sincere at all. So she basically wrote 4 poems based on the lives of these women who she interviewed. One of them was an Indigenous woman. She called that movement Grandmother Platypus, and she was a member of the Stolen Generation. Very, very moving, beautiful words. Another one was about a Greek immigrant who had come from a very poor background. Her parents had really struggled when they arrived here in Australia, and she, in the meantime, has become a very successful fashion designer. And another one is a young woman who has had cancer for most of her life. Very tragic story, but very uplifting. And finally, one of which I'm going to do a small excerpt. This one is called Dancer in the Dark, and it was a woman who had suffered major abuse in childhood and had overcome that and had just found a new partner and started a family. So this is a tiny excerpt from that. You've surely heard this one before. That love can heal the deepest wounds. I've taken back my heart and hands and found with Paul a place to dance. that gives you just a tiny snippet. I found, it just a great challenge. I found I had to obviously learn the music first, and a lot of it was quite difficult because Mary's not a guitarist, and anyone who is a guitarist knows the guitar's a very highly idiomatic instrument. So whenever composers write for the guitar, who are not themselves guitarists, the music can be quite challenging to play. So I had to learn the music first, I had to practice the words, and then somehow put them both together, it was really challenging, but it was very rewarding, and I ended up actually performing this piece just in my sort of standard recitals, where every other piece was just a normal piece of music. And again, I think the audience really enjoyed it. It was something different, and it added a kind of an emotional directness that I think you can achieve in using words, and then I think the music deepens those emotions. So that was a great experience, so much so that I wanted to do another project with Mary, and I asked her to write another piece for me, this time with choir. What I didn't expect is what she ended up doing, which is that she gave the choir no words. So the choir was entirely free, wordless. They made sounds, they sang ah, e, ah, etc. And I basically narrated and played at the same time. The subject matter that she chose was very difficult and extremely emotional. It was the Victorian bushfires of a few years ago. And there are 4 movements. The first one is called the butterfly. And I'll just read you a tiny bit from that. It's not easy to give you an excerpt of what this piece is about because it really needs the choir, but I'll just read you a little bit of the text, which also Mary wrote. The creatures of the air foretell the doom to come. Through an open window drift the silent butterflies, of one mind and in slow motion, sailing down to seek some shelter underneath a desk, innocence hiding from a monster. Now we know this is no ordinary day. So Mary went and actually interviewed people in King Lake, and apparently that is actually what happened. Butterflies were one of the first signs they started to fly into houses because they had a sense of the smoke and the fires. So very, very eerie kind of image that was shared with her. The next movement is called Book of Flames, and it's really beyond a one-person lecture to give you a demonstration of that, so I'm not going to try. Then Threnody, obviously, and finally the Phoenix. And this is when everything had settled, and literally there were no birds, there was no wildlife, everything was dead. There was not even a breeze. And one of the people recounted these words to her, and I will play you this. You have to imagine a choir. But 17 days later, ringing out across the wasteland, the sound of frogs. We dare to dream of life again. To rise above these ashes. Like the phoenix. So the challenge with this piece, apart from again having to speak and play at the same time, was how incredibly emotional the content was. And in a lot of the performances, there was really, really obvious sobbing from people in the audience because this was only about a year after the fires that we premiered this, and was very, very close to people's hearts. And even a number of the people, I did it probably 5 times with choirs, various choirs around the country, and each one of them, a number of the people in the choir really struggled emotionally. And obviously if you get too emotional, you can't perform. So it's that fine balance of being in the emotion and the realness of the content, but not being so deeply into it that you can't actually perform. And singing obviously is very difficult if you're extremely emotional. So that was a real challenge, and I found that even for me it was quite difficult to be in the emotion, but to find where the sort of ceiling of that was for me to still be able to talk and play at the same time. But it was a beautiful experience, and probably, obviously, goes without saying, the most difficult performance in many ways was in Melbourne, because it was so close to people's hearts. And strangely enough, we actually had real problems promoting it in Melbourne, because people were it was probably not ideally close to Christmas. It was sort of December or something that the performance was on at Melbourne Recital Centre, and the media just did not want to touch it at all because of the subject matter, and it was close to Christmas and they didn't want to dredge up this sad subject matter. So that was interesting. I kind of thought, oh, this is so relevant to Victoria, and yeah, it was interesting to me that people actually just found it too confronting. But nonetheless, I managed to perform it in Perth and in Melbourne and in Brisbane, and I think possibly in Sydney, I can't remember. But it was, in Adelaide I did it as well. So yeah, it was nonetheless a great project, and something that I really enjoyed, even though it was very difficult. So on to something much lighter. I'm sort of going in chronological order of the words and music projects that I've done over the last few years. So I've now moved forward to 2013, and this is completely different. I did a project for the Babies Proms series at the Sydney Opera House, which is for 2 to 5-year-olds, obviously not talking about the Victorian bushfires. And yeah, so what happened with this is that I worked with Jess Chumba, who's a wonderful percussionist, and so we were the 2 performers. Many of you probably know Jess or have seen him perform. He's a wonderful storyteller, and not only an incredible percussionist, but a great storyteller, a really good singer. So we decided we were going to do this project together, and I worked with 2 theatre writers and directors, Tim McGarry and Eva Di Cesare, who are Sydney-based, and we were going to create this project. Now, a small problem came up in that the Sydney Opera House advertised it with the name Olé, without asking us. So we had to write a show called Olé. And I don't actually play flamenco, and olé is a term used in flamenco. So we had to really think on our feet, and I ended up Googling olé and discovered very conveniently that it is a Spanish boy's name. So suddenly it made a bit more sense. Olé became our main character. And Olé goes on an adventure. I wanted this to be mostly Latin music, a little bit of Spanish and mostly Latin music. So Olé actually ended up being like a little boy spirit who is born in Mexico, gets lost in a storm, and ends up, after this storm, in Spain, and has to find his way back home. And he goes via an albatross back across the pond to various South American countries, and he has with him his clave sticks. And he remembers his father telling him that no matter what happens to you in life, if you play your clave sticks, you'll always find friends, and they will always make music with you. So this was the premise of the story. Ole travels through many countries, playing the rhythms of that country. Obviously very lively, with the kids doing actions and making the storm and all kinds of things. Really, really good fun. And finally, Ole arrives back in Mexico, helped by a very large lizard, a Mexican iguana, who helps him find his way home to a place called La Bamba. That's probably all I need to play that, really. So needless to say, this was great fun. I'd always wanted to play La Bamba, let's be honest. It's a bit of a teenage thing for me, so I really enjoyed that show. The thing that I found really challenging, apart from the fact that an audience of 2 to 5 year olds can be really scary, is the fact that I had to sing. I really tried to get out of singing, and I was just convinced by everyone. It wasn't in the initial brief, but it became really obvious that if I didn't sing, it would look really strange to these kids. Jess was singing, and Jess, obviously being male, has a low voice, and he said, you have to sing, because you have to sing at their, at their pitch. I'm a contralto, really a tenor, so it wasn't really my pitch. I was very uncomfortable with having to sing, so that was my great challenge in that project. Probably not something I'm in a rush to repeat, having to sing, with children or no children. But it was really fun, and again, the storytelling was obviously great. The kids were so into the story, and loved watching all the different instruments and the guitar and all the percussion instruments, and we got them to make sounds, and we got them to clap along various rhythms. We got them to dance sort of basic steps, and they're just so engaged and free of any kind of self-consciousness. So it was a really beautiful show, and we did get the parents to sing along to La Bamba and Guantanamera, so that made singing a little bit more bearable. But really fun show, and again, just a really great experience, and an unexpected experience for me. Certainly not something I had planned. All the other things were sort of things I guess I had sort of set up, and this is really something I was asked to do. So that was really fun. So I'm going to move forward a little bit now again to last year, probably 2014 that this began. I knew that I wanted to do another project combining words and music. I should look at the time. And again, I knew I wanted to do something different to what I had done before. So I actually saw Tamar Matheson performing with Camerata. I don't know if any of you have seen any of the shows he's done about composers, where he basically presents an autobiography playing the composer. So the one I saw was the Johann Sebastian, the one about Bach. And I just thought it was brilliant. I thought he was brilliant. I thought the writing which he had done was brilliant. And I approached him and said, I really want to work with you. I love this kind of genre of mixing words and music, mixing storytelling and drama and music. And luckily he was interested. So we had many chats with many crazy ideas. We ended up thinking that doing Don Quixote, Quixote, would be a good idea. And then we realised that actually, bizarrely enough, the Los Angeles Guitar Quartet had done a project with an actor doing that very story. So we had to go back to the drawing board, because we didn't want to, replicate something. Even though we had thought of it independently, this often happens, of course. So we went back to the drawing board, and Tamar had the idea of the great story of Don Juan, who is obviously a hero that appears in the writings of various people. but very famously and very brilliantly in the epic poem by Lord Byron. So we decided that that would be the basis of our show, that we would combine the poetry, selections from the poem, with music, and that we would also, that Tamar would play Lord Byron and tell his very scandalous and colourful life story. So that show kind of evolved. Most of it was developed by Skype. Tamar was in London at the time, and he wrote the script and sort of came up with a few points where he thought music could go, and that was the part we really worked on together, and I made suggestions of where I thought it could go and how I think it could how I thought it could work, and so on. And yeah, I might just play you a little bit, and then I guess I can talk to you a little bit more about how the music was incorporated. So inevitably this is a Spanish piece, because Don Juan is a Spanish character. And this actually opens the show. So on. So I use that piece as bookends to the show. So I play kind of the beginning of it, probably the first half of it, the show runs, and then I play the end of it at the end of the show. I'm going to give you a little excerpt, and this is really, you need to use a lot of imagination because I'm not Tamar Matheson and I can't do a Scottish accent, so I'm not going to try. But I'm going to start with a little excerpt from the poem. So Byron basically talks as himself and then also reads to the audience excerpts from his poem. So that's where I'm going to start. Of all the barbarous Middle Ages, that which is most barbarous is the middle age of man. It is, I really scarce know what, but when we hover between fool and sage, I don't know justly what we would be at. Too old for youth, too young at 35 to herd with boys or hoard with good 60. Love lingers still, although it were late to wive. And as for other love, the illusions o'er. And money, that most pure imagination, gleams only through the dawn of its creation. That's from my Don Juan, a very popular book at present. No doubt you've read it. Now, I'm no real judge of my own writing. I tend to think it's all rather marvellous. But of all the works I've written, I flatter myself that this poem might remain when I'm gone. It's not a great work, not a magnum opus in the Miltonic sense. I hate that sort of pretension. Only the lowest poets strive for that sort of immortality. Instead, it's an epic of gossip and chatter, of ramblings and digressions, the poet whispering in his reader's ear and colluding with him in a spot of tittle-tattle for 40,000 lines. Ordinary conversation in verse. The rhodomontade and grandiloquence of great works bores me. Real humanity shines in informality. As I'm sure you've guessed, this poem is a kind of mirror of my life. As such, you may think this is a somewhat unkind portrait of my father, but that is only because truth is unkind. Mad Jack Byron, as he was known, did very little for me other than the physical act of begetting me, and he was drunk when he did that. He was not particularly interested in being a father or a husband, except as it helped to line his pockets, People say he only married my mother for her money. But to be fair, they only say that because it's true. In any case, he swiftly proceeded to lose everything in a series of foolhardy speculations and left us in considerable destitution. For the first 9 years of my life, I felt the grind of poverty. But despite this, I believe my father was fairly happily married. My mother, on the other hand, wasn't. The real trouble was that she had married in absence. Mad Jack was very rarely home, and when he was, it was only to obtain enough money to get away again. Oh, he loved being with us, no doubt. Only he loved being without us more. He adored my mother deeply, but liquor was his first mistress, and gambling, and the occasional mistress. But he received his just deserts in an early death, and I cannot judge him further than he has already been judged by fate. His greatest legacy to me, perhaps, was to leave me with an early horror of matrimony, which seemed to my youthful understanding merely another word for quarrel. But we are neglecting our story. So obviously while I was playing, Tama is speaking the poem, so you have to use a lot of imagination there. So basically, the way that this evolved is that the poem, whenever he was speaking the poem, was obviously almost always an opportunity for music. And I started to develop recurring pieces that recurred throughout the play to signal certain things. So this piece, the very well-known, very Spanish La Paloma, signalled always the story in the poem of Don Jose and Donna Inez, who are a kind of a reflection of Byron's own parents, but sort of a Spanish version. And he called Don Juan Don Juan, by the way, and he rhymes it with Don Juan because he's Scottish, so he calls him Don Juan. And Don Juan has quite a lot in common with Lord Byron himself. He was quite the Don Juan himself. So I chose various pieces that recurred. As I said, that one for a Spanish, to set the scene in Spain when he's talking about his parents. Another piece that I used, I should have said that the play is set towards the end of Byron's life. He's actually quite ill, and he's reflecting back on his life. He's in Greece, and he actually passed away in Greece. So he's telling us this story, but he's actually already quite sick. So he has these terrible stomach cramps. So we had some illness music that kept recurring. So that piece and parts of it kept recurring to signal his illness, and sometimes he would obviously feel the illness and then the music would start, but occasionally the music kind of showed the audience that he was feeling unwell. So it was a great opportunity for the music to become almost another character in the play, because the music could signal things ahead of when he spoke about them, and of course vice versa. Now Tama had this is the only piece of music that he really suggested and that he really wanted. He said, wouldn't it be kind of clever and funny if we had a little excerpt from Don Giovanni in the play? I have to say we did it, and I think it's probably lost on most people. Wouldn't be lost on you people, but it's been probably lost on a lot of the more theatre audiences that we've performed this. But in any case, so he's in the middle of the poem and he's talking about the young Don Juan when he's 16, and he's just about to seduce the 23-year-old friend of his mother's. And I had to follow Tamar's request and find an excerpt from Don Giovanni on the guitar. And I did. I found it in an obscure piece, a fantasy on operatic themes by the guitarist and 19th century guitarist composer Johann Caspar Matz. To which Byron responds, quite so. So I think you get a bit of an overview. I'll just take you a little bit further along in the poem. So it's a lot of flirting, a lot of kind of her sort of fighting him off, and finally he manages to seduce her. And instead of going into any kind of distasteful details about what happens, we have a Spanish tango. You get the idea. So it's lots of fun. I also get to have a couple of cameo roles. I kind of, at one point, play the ghost of Lord Byron's dead mother. I make all kinds of sound effects on the guitar. Some of the other pieces of music that recur, there's a beautiful Scottish folk song which is obviously very close to his heart, and that recurs right at the end when he's thinking about his life, so that becomes, you know, again, the music creates a very poignant moment. And yeah, I get to play the woman that was just seduced and pretending nothing's happening when her husband finds her, and all this kind of thing. So there's lots of fun, and for me it was the first time that I have acted with another person, so that was very nice to be able to do that on stage. We premiered that last year at QPAC, and we've toured it a little bit, and we're touring it a lot more this year, so it's a really, really rewarding project. Again, probably half words, half music. And I think the same kind of thing, you know, it draws the music audience in and they become fascinated by the story, and the theatre audience becomes interested in the music. So it's a lovely kind of, again, you know, taking people perhaps out of what they're used to and what they thought they were coming to see, and showing them, you know, a melding of these two art forms. So really rewarding. The other thing I found really interesting in working with Tamar, who I have to say is very musical, and maybe this would not always be the case with all actors, but he is particularly musical. He comes from a very musical family, and I found that accompanying him, which is essentially what I'm doing when he's speaking the poem, the focus is definitely on the words, is really similar to accompanying a singer. There's a real kind of working together. If I get slightly faster, he will go with me. There's rubato, which I didn't expect. I didn't expect that in accompanying someone speaking. There's rowels, there's crescendos and decrescendos. Fair enough, you expect that. But the amount of kind of rhythmic push and pull, particularly in the poem, not so much when he's talking freely as Byron, but when he's, you know, in the verse, was really amazing and really surprised me, and was yeah, again, just a really lovely experience to have, and a new experience. So finally, I'm just going to talk, oh dear, I've gone over time, sorry, I'll be very quick. Just going to talk very briefly. This is the newest project that I co-created with a very large cast of people. Topology, the wonderful contemporary ensemble based in Brisbane, who are also composers as well as being performers. Trent Dalton, who's an incredible journalist and filmmaker. David Kelly, great photographer and videographer. And we created a project which we called Love Stories. It began because I knew I wanted to collaborate with Topology. We'd been talking for a few years about doing something together. We were kind of brainstorming. I knew Trent Dalton. Through a sort of a coincidence, I realised that he was not only, I knew him as a journalist, and I realised he was also a great filmmaker, and he had done some incredible work with homeless people in Brisbane and interviewing them, writing up these beautiful stories, and he was has been and continues to be quite involved with a homeless drop-in centre in the Valley called the 139 Club. So we wanted to essentially document some of these stories, but in an uplifting way. So we called the project Love Stories, and basically Trent interviewed these beautiful, generous people talking about love, and the stories and the sort of the generosity that came out, and the humanity in these stories. All of them, of course, with many layers of tragedy, but also so joyful and uplifting in so many cases, were really, really beautiful. They were filmed, obviously, with consent, and Topology wrote music to go with the film. And we ended up, one of the challenges in this was having to perform with a click track for the whole film. So basically what happened is that the film was shown. We ended up actually performing it at a cinema first, at New Farm Cinema. And we were performing live with the film. Some of the unexpected things that came out of that, or one probably that really stood out for me is, and none of us had any idea this was on the film. This is literally, a month or a few weeks before we were going to have this show, and we were presented the films, and Topology were going to write the music, and this amazing woman, her name's Leonora, she's asked, what is love? And her answer is, love is music. And she talks about what music has meant to her in her life, and despite all the, terrible things that have happened to her, and, losing her family and losing her home and everything else, she's from South America. She then ends, the film actually ends, with her singing a cappella, without any instrument, perfectly in tune, perfectly in rhythm, a song that she obviously knew very well, and I kind of recognised was probably a flamenco song. I didn't know how to find it. I contacted a friend who's a flamenco guitarist, and he said, oh yeah, it's a Tango Del Almendro, it's a really well-known song, no problem. So for me, that was the most special moment. I ended up then getting him to write an accompaniment for me, which was kind of sort of flamenco. I don't really play flamenco, but I can, play a little bit of flamenco, as all classical guitarists can. And that ended up actually being the end of the film, her singing that song and me accompanying her live, basically. Incredibly moving, and made all the more powerful by the fact that I think almost everyone that was in the film actually came to the premiere, and the emotion in the room was just incredible. So it was a really, really, really rewarding project. It was quite challenging financially, because it's very expensive to put on such a big project, but beautiful. And for me personally, this was part of an Australia Council fellowship, so I was very lucky to have the support to be able to create a project, and I was able to therefore be the kind of person that did most of the kind of, you know, collaborations and, you know, talking and trying to get it all to sort of happen, and everyone obviously did their creative part in it. So I think I'll finish with just a little tiny excerpt of the theme from Love Stories, which was written by Rob Davidson. So that's it. Thank you.